Well, good afternoon. It is Monday, December 3rd, start of the monthly Transportation Commission meeting. We're starting a little late. It's 3:40. I will call the roll. Tracy Hopkins.
Present.
Ryan Lancaster.
Present.
Stephen Lewis.
Here.
Ballard's here. Tricia Matthews.
Here.
Ryan Leslie.
Here.
We have it spelled right?
Yes.
Okay. Ryan Hall is absent. David McKinney appears to be absent. Charlene Pedersen, absent. Mark Wasdall.
Present.
Luke Kavanaugh.
Here.
John Martin.
Here.
Tony Tisdale. Rondo Gilbert, but substituting is, or excuse me, you're the.
I'm the new guy.
You're not the pinch hitter. You're full time now. Okay, excuse me. Your name again is.
Brian Parker.
Thanks, Brian. You don't even have it spelled close, Mr. Parker, so we'll have to get that corrected. Get you on the lineup. Thank you. Miranda Carson.
Here.
Very good. Item 2, the adoption of the agenda. Any changes, comments, or discussions the proposed agenda?
Mr. Commissioner, it would seem prudent to again postpone number 4, the introduction of Commissioner Pedersen. But other than that, I move to approve the agenda with that amendment.
I have a second.
I have a second.
Mr. Hopkins, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes of the November 5, 2018 meeting.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
if I can start, a couple of things. First, sorry to Brian for leaving Rhonda's name on there, just trying to get the agenda out and forgot that last time we had mentioned that you were going to be a permanent replacement for Rhonda. So going forward, we'll do that. And then Mr. Wasdall sent me an email earlier today too on the minutes for last month. David Price is actually Justin Price, and he's going to be the regular attender as well. So Mr. Wasdall is back up, and I anticipate we'll see him from time to time. But next month we'll have Justin Price. So, but again, for the minutes purposes, last month, let's take David and make that Justin. And then Tricia Matthews was here, and somehow it got the 0 there. So just let the record reflect in the minutes that she was here as well. So those are the couple. There may be other changes, but those are the couple errors in the minutes that I would request that whoever makes the motion incorporate into the adoption.
Mr. Lancaster, do you have a motion?
Sure, if so desired. Yeah, what he said.
Okay, so we have Tricia Mathis present, Justin Price, and the notation for Mr. Parker. Any other changes, typos, corrections, additions?
I second it with the amendment.
Very good. I'll call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. I'll get those signed, Mr. Hood. Okay, approval of the minutes. Mr. Lancaster, we're skipping 4. On to old business. Transportation projects update. Mr. Hood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item 5A on your agenda, transportation projects update. There's a memo that's been put together. It's on page 6 of your packet for today's meeting. As per usual, anything that's bold is new information. A lot of this information is old. We are still in the first quarter of a new fiscal year, but I don't have a whole lot of things just with the winter season being upon us to really provide updates on. We will, I do want to draw to your attention just as part of this, although most of the information is actually in the staff communications section. regarding US 2026 Chinden Boulevard. There was open house held, and there's some summary information of kind of what ITD is planning on doing with that corridor right now that I think maybe as time allows, we can spend a little bit more time staff communications later in the meeting, but I just want to draw your attention to that now. I did also, part of the other correspondence from Mr. Wasdall today, he's going to maybe provide some updates on that item, maybe other items too under the ITD heading, just to make sure that they're accurate. He pointed out that some of those updates now are, and the information there is a year old, so just, you know, carrying it back so it's most relevant and doesn't kind of go back and forth, and maybe it's confusing in the way it's worded. So I appreciate his help if you want to help, you know, pare that down or make it what we think the information most important and appropriate is in there. Just the other thing to bring to your attention is an update on compression brakes and the compression brake ordinance. So last month you all did make a recommendation to the city council that the city evaluate establishing a unmuffled compression brake ordinance within the city. I carried that forward to the city council meeting on November 13th. Council discussed that. There were a couple of members from the public that were here as well. There was no public testimony given. It wasn't a public hearing. It was just a staff report, basically, of your recommendation to them. There were some people in the audience that were tracking it. Long story short, the council did direct staff to come up with a sample or a draft ordinance for their consideration. So that's what we'll be doing. They didn't say come back at a certain date, but there will be a public involvement piece to that then when we get a draft ordinance put together. I envision that happening here in the near term. I don't think it's going to be an overly complex ordinance. There was some discussion, and I know Councilman Kavanagh was there, so feel free to jump in if you want to add anything. You know, there was some conversation from the police department about this being kind of a feel-good ordinance. No one should be under the impression that there's going to be a whole bunch of tickets written for violation. It's just very difficult to, really the way I understand it, there's two ways to basically ticket somebody. One is if the officer sees it and pulls it over and writes them up a ticket there. The other, if it's going to be someone in the public that witnesses, they have to be able to identify the driver. And it's going to be near impossible for them to call the police, see the driver, identify them after they're already down the road. So it really is something, I think, and I'm not putting words in council's mouth, but it was really, the end game would be to put up the signs, hey, welcome to Meridian, please don't use your compression brakes. More of an education component for the drivers, but the enforcement arm is probably going to be lacking. So that's kind of, again, just my kind of summary of that, but it's moving forward. Not adopted yet, still up for discussion. No decisions have been made, but at least the direction was to draft something to chew on further.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Kavanagh.
I can add a couple things just for clarification. I wasn't at that meeting. I was at the National League of Cities
Okay.
conference, but watched from the comforts of my hotel room while in Los Angeles. I think there are a couple other important points to note. I don't want to put words in Caleb's mouth or in the police department's mouth. I don't know if it was necessarily feel-good legislation. It was a real challenge for law enforcement about how are we going to enforce this. I think the other piece that is council brought up some valid questions is it would include an exemption for our fire trucks, for emergency responding vehicles. And I know some of the questions from council would be, well, if for whatever reason the scenario which a semi-truck is out of control and needed to use its compression brakes to regain control, would we really prohibit them from being able to do that? And I don't think that anybody on this commission would think that, no, in that particular case, we would be okay with it. So it's trying to, I think, straddle the line between adhering to what the feedback you heard from our community, with also making sure that the legislation or ordinance could be enforced easily by our law enforcement. So I know those were some of the feedback that was given to staff. I'm looking forward to seeing what an ordinance or a model ordinance would look like, and ultimately giving our community the opportunity to come and provide some public testimony on it.
I apologize. I thought he was at that meeting. I just assumed so. And yes, I shouldn't say feel-good ordinance either. So my words and not police or anybody else's, so.
Okay, very good. Well, I'd look forward to seeing that proposed ordinance or that meeting and be happy to be at the table and have some discussion. I was not able, on the 13th, I was at another business commitment, so, very good. Thank you. Any other points to discuss with Mr. Hood on his update?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Lancaster?
out of curiosity more than anything, has anything changed on the Lime issues since last we met? You know, it seems like they've just moved the scooters from Meridian to Boise and, oh, there's a memo here. Oh, I should read
So,
my
Mr.
packet.
Chair,
Mr. Hood?
I can-
Excuse me,
No,
I don't mean to cut you off,
I've
Mr.
introduced the topic and whatever, yeah.
I can provide a little bit of an update. So yes, I do know that our legal department has drafted an ordinance and as well as a kind of a companion MOU. We have an internal meeting this Wednesday to look at that. I envision that being shared then with, at least with Lime and Bird, because they're the two we know that are interested in our community at this point in time, but could be used and shared with others that may be interested. I also am going to be getting a demonstration from both of those organizations on their app within their phone or other devices, I guess. You could probably have the application on to just see if there's something the city can do to assist them in educating their users and their juicers. That's only a Lime thing, but their rechargers. Where to place these, where you can ride them safely, what the ordinances and laws are, those types of things. And so really looking at their capabilities that they have ingrained within their application. The goal is to do this sooner than March 15th. That's kind of the absolute drop dead. You know, we're not trying to drag our feet. We're trying to solve this, or at least make sure our ducks are in a row more than they were at the original launch. So it is moving forward. I think council's asked for an update. I don't know if that's been scheduled or not, but I know that council's asked for that update. So I imagine here in the next couple of weeks that there will be an update given to council because they're asking those same questions. Where are we?
President.
Mr. Kavner?
And just to add maybe some added clarification from Caleb for Commissioner Lancaster, it sounds like that we're going to send an invitation to both representatives of Bird and Lime for, I believe, our workshop in January. There should be a memo that I know that is going to be sent to council next week. I assume there would be no issues with us forwarding that on to your commission to be able to review that as well, taking into account some of the feedback that has been communicated to both of those entities, as well as I think to include some of the language that has been crafted by legal. So hopefully all parties would be able to be apprised of an update by next week, with a follow-up meeting to happen at our workshop in January.
All right,
Mr. Lancaster?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that satisfies my curiosity.
Well, without being a gossip mongerer, there was a news report, and I wished I could remember the city, another American city, the same kind of growing pain that Meridian has experienced. Lime shows up one day, and there's a conversation that, yes, we got permission, no, you didn't get permission, but it's still some of the same issues that Meridian is dealing with. How does it launch? What's the liability? What are the regulations? We may very well be figuring out our own regulations. All cities are struggling with this, or there's the challenge, let me put it that way. And that's the takeaway.
All right, thank you.
Okay, 5A, old business, completed, closed. New business items. Sergeant Arnold, 6A, Meridian Police Department status report. Good afternoon, Sergeant.
So the police department, over the last couple of months, I know I missed the November meeting. Probably the big things to talk about, 2 fatality crashes that we've had in Meridian since the last meeting that I was here. We had one involving a cement truck and a pedestrian. The second one, I'd kind of like to say is a blinking yellow arrow crash, but really isn't. The driver was actually trying to make a left turn from the outside through lane and went across the number 1 lane and through the turn lane and some other things. Both of those crashes have been investigated. Both of them are sitting at the prosecutor's office. We're just waiting on determination on charging for both of them. Other than that, one of our motor officers retired this month, so we're down 1 motor position. Hopefully that'll be filled sooner than later. Other than that, it's been pretty much business as usual.
Very good. Any follow-up for Sergeant Arnold on, we'll just kind of throw it open. If Mr. Lancaster, do you have a question for any of the previous topics?
You just start with me every time, don't you? We've been doing this too long, I guess, huh, Commissioner Ballard, but.
Long enough.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a question for Sergeant Arnold, and we've kind of already discussed this. Caleb and Councilman Kavanagh kind of stole the thunder I was going to ask, but I was curious about, police's take on the enforcement. And I know they've already addressed that, but if you had anything else to add.
On which part of the enforcement?
I'm sorry, on the enforcement of the, unmuffled compression brakes or an ordinance that way.
Yeah, I have to agree. I was at the meeting when the chief was there talking about the enforcement part of it, and it's going to be really difficult to enforce, especially when you have a department full of people that are not familiar with what a compression brake is and what an unmuffled versus a muffled compression brake sounds like, and then responding to the calls from the citizens. And like Councilman Kavanagh was saying, the identification of the driver is key to that. And without that, even if we go and talk to the driver later and the driver says, yeah, it was me and I did it and I'm sorry, that person still has to go to court and say, yeah, that was the guy that did it. And it just makes it really hard for us to be able to enforce that. I like the idea of maybe putting some ownership back on the trucking companies themselves, saying, please don't use your brakes, your compression brakes while you're in the city limits. But yeah, responding to calls from citizens, especially in situations where we're not going to be able to do anything about it, is going to be the hard part for us.
And I imagine in the priority of things, life and limb compression brakes probably ranks low as far as, what we really want you to
for us,
work on,
it's
I
still
guess.
a quality of life thing. I put myself in those people's shoes. When they call in, they're frustrated, they're irritated, they're annoyed at what's going on. We want to try and help them out. I don't like the idea of calling it a feel-good ordinance. Sorry, can I just throw that one out there? But, we have to keep their feelings in mind when they call in. They're not calling in because they heard this for the first time. And it's just like speeding complaints in neighborhoods. People don't call in the first time somebody goes by their house at 35 miles an hour. They start seeing these patterns, and then that's when they start calling us and complaining. And we want to try and help them as best we can. Just sometimes, in this case, we just don't have an answer for them right now.
Thank you. That was my only question.
Very good. Any
Mr.
other,
Chairman?
Mr. McKinney?
I suppose I ought to first, of course, mention that I am here now, so you can indicate me on the roll, even though I was late. Sergeant Arnold, just a quick question for you. The 2 fatality accidents you mentioned, where did they occur?
The cement truck and pedestrian crash was at Ustick and Eagle, right during commuter traffic. And then the second one was at Cherry and 10 Mile.
Okay,
And both
thank
of
you.
them were right in the intersection.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Leslie.
Sergeant Arnold, did you have, I know we only had the scooters here for a short while, but you guys deal with Eagle Road where I know some scooters appear. Did you have any issues with riders being less than intelligent on those scooters?
Personally, I didn't. I didn't talk to any of the other patrol sergeants to see if their teams had any issues with them. So I don't know. I don't think I could effectively speak for the city or the agency as far as problems on Eagle Road or any of the other roads for that matter.
You guys didn't probably get any calls on them?
Not that I know of.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have
Mr.
one
Rapp?
question. Sergeant, since they've overlaid and restriped Meridian Road, did some work on the Overland intersection, have you guys seen any improvement going over to and from over the Meridian deck?
Over the overpass?
Yeah.
Not so much. We still get our morning rear end collisions on the south side of the intersection for northbound traffic. One of the things that we've really kind of seen an uptick in is the left turning on the blinking yellow arrow at Overland. I think we're at 4 or 5 crashes there now because of that, since that's become a blinking yellow arrow. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on.
Seems like in the evenings, the timing on the lights coming out of Meridian headed south is back in traffic, clear up into, shoot, almost Pine. So I was curious if you've seen anything like that. It's causing any trouble. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, Mr. Hood?
if I can, just speaking of the protected permissive, you mentioned Chinden Linder 2-3 months ago, and maybe following back or looking up on that.
Yeah, so Chinden and Linder, I think we've had one other crash there since we talked. Again, that one, I don't remember if that other crash was an injury crash, but I'm gonna go out and say it was, just based on the speeds that we have there. I know the one car that was making the left turn was actually knocked clear to the other direction and went about 50 feet from going eastbound and was turned westbound from the collision. So I would say somebody was probably at least injured somewhat in that crash. Since we did have that conversation, though, it's really, I think that's number 5 that we've had there since that was a blinking yellow arrow. I think every one of the crashes has also been eastbound traffic turning northbound onto Linder.
Any other questions, comments, discussion points for Sergeant Arnold? Very good.
Can I ask a question?
Mr. Ginkle?
So I didn't make the last meeting, but is there a particular area where the engine brakes are being called in on? Like one road, maybe one company?
You know, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that.
I can
I do like the idea of educating the companies, because I think they would do that. And if it's like concrete trucks or something like that, that's an easy deal.
I can, Mr. Chair, I can, the handful of folks that I've talked to have all been lived in the 10 Mile and Ustick intersection. I want to say Firelight Estates is the name of the subdivision, but don't quote me on that part. But that is the intersection that they've contacted the city with this concern, is on 10 Mile at Ustick. So my understanding is 10 Mile traffic, but near that intersection.
Any particular time of day?
I don't recall that being part of their concern. When they addressed you all, I don't remember them saying it was a particular time of day. So no, I don't remember that.
The gentleman from the subdivision that spoke, my sense was it was later in the evening, the midnight-ish to midnight to 6, somewhere in there.
I don't remember.
But I called on Mr. Ginkle, as you'll see in a minute. He's past chairman of the Idaho Trucking Association, and I made the note there that if we can communicate, I also sit on the Idaho Trucking Association, to get the education out, and Mr. Ginkle's comments are well taken. If we can identify something in specific, we also have a voice or can have a conversation. Anything else for Sergeant Arnold?
All right.
Kept you in the ring as long as I could, sir. Thank you. Moving on to 6C truck routes.
Mr. Chair, if we can just real quick on
6B.
6B.
Wait a minute. Okay, excuse me. I got ahead of myself. Hillsdale Elementary, 6B, excuse me, Hillsdale Elementary busing. Sarah Aguilera.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I did receive an email from Ms. Aguilera just 3:41, it looks like. So But I did get, so I let her know this was going to be on the agenda. She requested to be on the agenda. I told her last Wednesday that she was going to be on the agenda. She responded shortly thereafter last Wednesday saying, "Thank you. I'm passing on to other parents in our group. One of them will get back to you." And then I just received one from her, again at 3:41. It says, "Hi, Caleb. I realize the meeting is going on now. I don't believe any of the other parents involved got back to you. I'm leaving it in others' hands to pursue. Thank you for your time thus far, Sarah." So I don't know if that means maybe next month we'll have one of those other people in her party that wants to talk about this. There is some information in your packet if you want to be brought up to speed, but it doesn't look like certainly today it's going to be discussed. But there's some background information. It does like this group has talked to the school district previously, and I think Miranda even specifically, if I recall. And we've talked about it at the subcommittee with this subcommittee of this commission as well. So it has been an area of conversation. But anyways, I just want to let you know there isn't anybody today. If I hear from them in the next couple, 3 weeks, before the next agenda gets out, unless you have a problem, I don't have a problem adding them back onto the agenda, but kind of will stand by, and if I hear something, add it back on if that's okay.
Is
Not, if you don't want to hear it too.
questions in response to or follow-up to Mr. Hood's comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
so
Lancaster?
As Caleb said, this was a topic that we discussed in some extent at our first meeting, our kickoff of our school zone subcommittee. And I see that a couple of the emails are addressed to me, and I haven't done anything with them since they've come. But this, however we want to approach it, this could be something that we discuss further with when our school zone subcommittee gets together. Or if that's kind of why we formed that subcommittee. However you want to approach it, but it does seem like we should probably postpone that one for today at least. But.
Well, and Mr. Chair, if I can just follow up, and I think that's in one of the correspondences. I did offer that. I mean, I told her we have a group specifically formed for this, and she insisted on being at the Transportation Commission meeting. So I said, okay, yep, you're on the agenda. So, and that's why Commissioner Lancaster was copied on that, because he's kind of spearheading that group. And so I wanted to give him a heads up that, hey, there's maybe potential to talk about this at that subcommittee level, but anyway, so.
Mr. Lancaster, if I may, was there anything, or were there any next steps that came out of your subcommittee, or just you have a conversation to have a further conversation, or where?
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, and I'll look at Miranda for this too if she wants to add anything to it, but we did have some conversation there as far as, fill in, those others that were here, but we had some discussion about the construction happening there, the busing that was happening temporarily, and then we talked about some of the road conditions, and ACHD did leave with, Mr. Martin's colleague that's, represented on the subcommittee, he did leave the meeting, or after the meeting, he looked into the speed limit and the pedestrian hybrid beacon there. So there were some action items, if you will, from the meeting and reports back. So ACHD, as I recall, did lower the speed limit by 5 miles per hour on that part of Eagle Road and confirm that there is a pedestrian hybrid beacon here. But, Mr. Chairman, if it's all right, if Miranda wants to add anything else to that query also.
Ms. Carson?
So the school district, and when I say the school district, I mean myself, I worked with the builder to ensure that when the sidewalks were complete on the south side of Taconic, that we would have a crosswalk complete that the students could use to cross from the north side of Taconic to the south side to access that pedestrian hybrid beacon that's on the south side of Taconic and the Eagle intersection. We also put in a crossing guard that takes students across Eagle and then across Taconic as well. So the students are already on the north side of Taconic where the school is. The subcommittee worked to, as Mr. Lancaster said, the action item was that the speed limit was reduced on Eagle to 45, and there were school zone signs put up in advance of the pedestrian beacon on either side, north and south on Eagle. One of the comments in Ms. Aguilar's email is that the crosswalk across Taconic isn't marked. It is marked on the pavement. It's a painted crosswalk. I don't know that there's any signs before or after the crosswalk stating that there's a crosswalk coming, but it is marked on the pavement, so I'm thinking she must have meant signage on Taconic.
Okay, very good.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Hopkins?
so I live in this area. I've been watching next door feeds on this ongoing issue. I think, so if you go across the speed bump, which actually is probably a good place to put it and stuff, it's not like marked like a crosswalk. It looks like it's marked as a speed bump. It might be what she's talking about there. I mean, it is what it is. And I think another thing that I see on Nextdoor that you don't see and through this email chain is it seems like people in Black Rock, which is the subdivision up on top there, got little kids that they don't like walking that 1.3 miles. I think I saw that somebody had checked that he's got a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I don't know who makes a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old walk to school for 1.3 miles, but that's one of the things why they wanted the buses there. So kind of some background information to the.
So distance was a factor, but distance wasn't a factor that the district used. Distance isn't the reason that it wasn't in the walk zone before. So it wasn't in the walk zone last school year because of the safety, not because of the distance. So as a district across the entire West Ada School District, we have students from kindergarten to 12th grade that walk 1.5 miles to school. We don't expect a 5-year-old to walk 1.5 miles by themselves. I don't expect a 5-year-old to be at home for 30 minutes by themselves. You don't leave a 5-year-old by themselves. So we do think that parents would be walking with them, siblings would be walking with them. But 1.5 miles is based on a state statute. It is, the 1 mile is the safe routes to school. There's lots of articles that suggest students should walk a mile to school to get their 30 minutes of activity in every day. So that 1.5 miles comes straight from state statute, and that's what we use to determine our walk zones.
Very good. Any other comments? So, Mr. Hood, I'll take you up on your suggestion that if the group would like to invite themselves back over or back into a meeting, I'm assuming the commission would agree extend them that invitation. But it appears that this has been looked at and some steps have been taken, and we'll leave it at that for the time being then. Okay. 6B is completed. Now moving to 6C, truck routes. Mr. Hood asked if I would lead this discussion. I had volunteered several meetings ago to supply some work or some information about a truck ordinance. I did submit a brief outline to Caleb the other day, and Tricia Matthews expanded upon that, and I thought she did a pretty good job, and so Caleb is handing out an outline, and a lot of deference to Tricia Matthews putting together that information. Caleb and I met earlier today just for a cup of coffee to talk about how we organize this, how we want to hold this conversation. I liked Mr. Lancaster's approach on his school zone subcommittee, but the idea is what do we want to define, what are the sideboards, what are the parameters, if we want to hold this conversation about what we think may be of benefit to the city or to the citizens. With that in mind, I think the first question I have is, what are the complaints? What are the sticky areas? With that cup of coffee with Mr. Hood this morning, we reflected that over the last year, 2, 3 years, we've had various conversations about lane widths, turning radii, some questions. So I think at this time, we talk about what information we would like to discuss, and is there an ordinance? I had gathered up and sent out in my homework examples of 2 ordinances, one from Mountain Home and one from Lewiston. They take different approaches. I saw some ordinances from 1971 that just says no trucks downtown. That probably works in some smaller communities where the truck route or the main highway is south of town or north of town, whatever. And the only time you bring a truck into downtown or into a municipal area is when there's deliveries. Other than that, you do not need to cut through town. One other point, so if we start with that framework of what's bugging us or what is our concern, that's a framework. And I will make one other note, as I had mentioned earlier, Alan Ginkle, who's the past chairman of the Idaho Trucking Association, and was a business owner of a trucking company in Idaho Falls. So he has real life experience, and with his consent, if we have a specific question about trucks moving in and out of metropolitan areas, he may be able to provide some real life experience and how his company approached some of those challenges. I will note from my own studies that municipalities, as a local arm of government, they have some legislative or some statutory functions to address safety concerns in their city limits. If you go too far, too broad, you may bump into a federal preemption statute if states and municipalities attempt to regulate rates, routes, and services of over-the-road trucks. But with that said, I think there's a very broad overview of what it is that we can discuss as the commission. We can use Ms. Matthews' outline, if I can call it that. I think it's a very fair outline and go through that. So I will open it up to question, comments, or how do you want to dive into this? Let's ask the first question. If we talk about truck routes, what are some issues that you may have from your own experiences? Mr. Lewis?
Well, just from my own experience, there's always someone complaining about trucks on their local street. You know, they don't think that trucks should be near their neighborhoods. I know people complain. Well, we've heard recent complaints about people complaining about trucks on 10 Mile Road. You know, but that's a bit odd to me, since that's an arterial street and trucks are supposed to be there. So.
And you have businesses there, and so you're bringing freight in and out of those businesses. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants milk in the store.
Right.
Or, you know, their products. So, so there is that concern of are trucks on the right types of roads, if we physically, and to get to areas of commerce. Okay. Mr. McKinney.
Mr. Chairman, another consideration might be to differentiate between sizes of trucks. Because of course your FedEx and your UPS trucks are one thing as opposed to large, 18-wheel heavy trucks.
Sure.
And then the other question is, and I'm just trying to, I'm going through my mind thinking, and I'm trying to think of any commercial areas aside from the downtown area where we have commercial areas that are not adjacent to arterial streets. And at the moment, I'm not coming up with any, but I could be wrong on that, because that might be the one place to start. If truck routes include all arterials, and all commercial areas are on arterials, then the only restriction, then we just can simply make a distinction between arterials versus collectors or local, primarily residential streets. Anyway, so the type of road and the type of vehicle, I think, are the maybe two places to start.
Okay, and I'm thinking, Mr. McKinney, and I'm not trying to single out the company, but even here in front of City Hall, so you have Builder's Choice, that's over on 3rd and Broadway. So trucks have 3 ways to get into Builder's Choice. They can come in on 3rd from Franklin, and that's through a residential section. They can come in on Main and make a right onto Broadway, which brings them right in front of City Hall and then in the commercial area here. Or if they're using Pine. Now, that's a new wrinkle there with Pine being rebuilt. Do they use that to get in and out of their facility? There's a lot of rail activity. There's a lot of products unloaded there that either go into the yard or I think go on to over-the-road trucks from there. But that is one example, maybe unique to Meridian, because it grew around that, if you will, that you have trucks right in the middle of town, in downtown. You have your other areas, the Walmarts, the Fred Meyers, the Rite Aids, whatever, with those trucks, bringing freight in and out. Your other question, probably 3 kinds. So your little delivery vans are like the little UPS drop-off, FedEx drop-off, those vans. You can go to the next level up, which is the smaller trailers, 27-foot, local deliveries, or over-the-road 53-foot trailers, the larger trucks. So there's 3 types of traffic there. Another thing to keep in mind is city having a place at the table with the trucks that weigh 129,000 pounds, which are permitted through the highway districts. The state and federal say you can use certain roads with those configurations. So what is the city, what's their conversation about those trucks coming in the last mile? If a little lumber wants to go to Builder's Choice there, do we have that conversation? You also have Handy's cement factory down off of 5th. Those are 2 areas that I can think of, that I'm familiar with. Mr. Lancaster, excuse me.
No, it's fine.
All right.
You call on me even when I don't have a comment, but
It looked like you had one.
But you weren't first that time.
yeah, I wasn't first that time. So I don't know how much I have to add to the discussion. I know this comes up periodically in my day job, if you will. Working for the transportation department and highways. I remember one conversation in particular where a sort of resort town to the north of here, shall we say, wanted to divert trucks off the highway to, their local road system around their town. And, the question was posed, can we do that? And the answer was no. You know, the highway's the highway. That's what it's made for, is for trucks, right? So I suppose I probably default to that position. You know, public roads are public roads, and they're meant for, you know, any licensed vehicle that wants to drive on them. That's probably where I start. And, you know,
Well, is it a rule of, another aspect is, so the Compass report that I attached, so that was initiated by federal funding some 6-7 years ago to figure out what moves freight and by what modes of transportation. So overall, they identified where trucks currently are. Practically speaking, that's what's developed. A public road, a highway, an infrastructure that maintains the weight, maintains the turning radius, and, as Mr. Ginkle would talk about, looking to get the equipment in and out safely. So is there a practical rule of thumb that it kind of regulates? Nah, I don't want to go there. Or does it kind of take care of itself because some best practices have been developed?
and I'd say it probably does kind of take care of itself. You know, you mentioned turning radii and things like that. You know, there's streets where large tractor trailers just can't go physically, right? I mean, there's physical constraints that make that difficult. But yeah, I don't know where to go with all this.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, the Compass rate study, I recall the presentation that Lisa Ikonen gave to us on that. And one thing struck in my mind from that presentation was designing to accommodate trucks versus designing for trucks. And the example that she had in the report was like turning vehicles, for example. To accommodate trucks have to use all the available pavement to make that turn. But to design for trucks can stay in their own lane and make these turns at the intersection. So like on your point number 3, when we're talking about what infrastructure criteria, perhaps when we talk about truck routes, those are routes where we've made a concerted effort to incorporate truck-friendly design elements, if I can say that. You know, so that the intersections are wide enough so trucks can stay in their own lane when they're making turns. Use 12-foot lanes instead of 11 on those truck routes or truck-friendly routes. Just, those are some thoughts.
So by default then, Mr. Martin's efforts and Mr. Wasdall's efforts in talking about, I mean, state roads and county roads, or the county district roads, those things are kind of, those are taken into consideration when those roads are engineered and developed, I take it.
Well, I would say that the state highways pretty much all have truck-friendly elements. I don't think that all the district roads are truck-friendly, but it's just I don't know, I could be wrong there.
Okay. Well, just trying to get some feedback there. Yeah. Well, I'll step out by way of example. So when the Meridian Road in downtown, the planters were installed. I think as a practical matter, trucks say, unless I have to be there, that's not a route I'm going to take by design, and I'm being objective on that. There are some challenges for the businesses that are located near there on the freight coming in and out, but they've seemed to have solved that issue, I believe. So, Ms. Matthews, or is there it? Do you want to jump in, or work through, shall we work through your outline here?
Just go ahead and work through it. I
All right,
had a moment where I was just easier for me to input on the computer.
okay, all right. So I think so at point one, we're still talking about, as 10 Mile has been built. Well, let me back up and go one other route. So I'm on the Freight Advisory Committee, and so the Compass Study, that's the committee I'm on. But one example they use, through the city of Nampa, there are 3 highways, if I have this right. So you have state highways. As Mr. Lancaster, Mr. Lewis say, those are roads designed to move the commerce. But those 3 roads now go through downtown Nampa. And they cross through Nampa to get to the processing plants. The challenge is there as the city grows around, increases, you don't eliminate those trucks because the traffic still has to move there. So in looking at Meridian, do we have any challenges like that? We have 2026, that's a state highway. Eagle's a state highway 55.
69, Highway 69.
69 going out to Cuna. 16, when it comes online, will be there. Okay, let's talk about point 2. Any particular criterion? Land uses, if we think, so some of us that were in the comprehensive plan discussion earlier this afternoon, are there particular areas that we can identify or make choices about? For instance, the rail line is there, it's not going away. Particular businesses like to locate along the rail line for the advantage of having rail freight. But to move away from the rail, you have to have trucks of some capacity. And maybe the rail line is simply a natural, and to use Mr. Lewis's criterion, if they're designated arterials or state roads, so if, or by default, we're just saying strictly residential roads are off limits?
So, Mr. Chair, we can zoom around, but I do have up on the screen the city's future land use map. So it doesn't always reflect what's actually on the ground today, but it does show, at least just kind of to your point there, we are anticipating quite a bit of industrial use along the railroad tracks, at least on the south side between Franklin, or along Franklin and Black Cat. And certainly today, we have quite a bit of that, kind of that Franklin railroad Pine corridor. There's quite a bit of industrial use in our downtown, and again, kind of in that third of a mile in between Pine and Franklin today. So we can zoom around in here if you'd like, but I thought this might be helpful for part of that discussion if we do want to talk about the city's anticipating industrial uses along here. So certainly Franklin, although I think the point that's been made, I mean, most of the arterials fairly easily accommodate truck traffic. I guess maybe just one more kind of side note. You mentioned it, Commissioner, but it was probably about a year and a half ago, but we did send some comments off to ACHD when they were looking at designing 10 Mile Road about having at least the potential for one 12-foot wide lane for truck traffic, as well as buses, were the other concern that there's quite a few school buses that run along there, and with their rearview mirrors and whatnot, they tend to be fairly large and tend to want to drive on the outside lane where you got a bike lane and having, smacking, somebody upside the head with a mirror or something like that. So we did ask that ACHD consider, if they could, fit it in the right-of-way, design at least one 12-foot wide lane on 10 Mile. Just a little bit of the history on that. 10 Mile kind of has become a mini de facto truck route, just because State Highway 16 wasn't built as it was originally planned. It was supposed to originally just connect up with I-84 from day one. Well, the state scaled that back, and so you were left with a situation now where it ends at 2026, and so truck traffic tends to use 10 Mile to get to the interstate. Maybe a temporary condition. 16's moving ahead. Construction dollars still aren't found, but looking at right-of-way acquisition here in the near future, so it may be sooner rather than later. But anyway, just a little bit more. We have kind of identified 10 Mile as a sort of de facto truck route where we're like, hey, that could actually move larger rigs in the future, and we've made such comments to the Highway District as they're looking at designing improvements to that corridor. So anyways, I got the future land use map up here. If you want to look at any particular parts of town, I can zoom in. Maybe just one other thought that I had. The question was asked earlier. I think it was Commissioner McKinney that asked it. Most of your commercial users are along arterials. We do have a couple though that I guess that came to mind when I was thinking of that. You do have some just off of Eagle, like Lowe's, where they use the alleys or records kind of backage road. I'm in the wrong intersection, so I shouldn't be pointing there. Should be here. But this backage road that we've talked about before, I honestly don't know how the trucks maneuver in and out of Lowe's here, but I imagine that they use records. It's still on an arterial, but they're using Records Avenue. The other one that I thought of was, actually two, is Silverstone and El Dorado, which are at Overland and Eagle. I don't know how much truck traffic is in there, but it's a commercial use where you have potential for truck traffic where, again, you get in off of the arterial network pretty good into some of these more local streets. Again, I'm not aware of any real warehouse or, but here, just an example of having some commercial use that isn't really that close to any arterial. It's kind of back into a neighborhood. But for the most part, you're right. Most of our commercial stuff is generally adjacent to arterial. But anyways, I just thought of some of those that you have. Anyways, if that's valuable or not. But.
Okay. Thank you. Other points of conversation? Do we have any recommendation or what is it that we move forward on or we're not moving forward on?
Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm not ready to answer that yet, but I guess just another thought I have sitting here is, it seems that we're talking about two different things as far as movement of freight and goods, right? So point-to-point travel versus service travel, right? You talked about you want to buy milk at the grocery store, right? I mean, whatever, if we were to designate truck routes, there's going to be trucks that have to leave the truck routes, right?
Yes.
Deliver gas, deliver groceries,
right.
All that stuff. And so I think we need to make that differentiation, I guess, in our discussion. Are we talking about the, point-to-point origin, destination, truck routes and that's I guess that's where that freight study falls out, right? That's what that's for. So I don't know. To me, it seems there has to be that differentiation. And then, if truck routes are designated, I guess my question that I keep coming back to is, what does that mean, right? Is that, based on what I just said about there's still going to be trucks that have to leave the truck route, so what's the purpose of the truck route, right? So I guess those are some questions that maybe you can help answer for me.
Well, as I looked at the ordinance, so if you take the city of Lewiston, that seems to be a rather specific ordinance, and I don't know this, but my conjecture is that those routes were developed to get in and out of the paper mill and the sawmill and those wood products.
Or the port, probably.
Yeah, right. So you got the Port of Lewiston up there. And so the city says, okay, there's a number of ways to get into those the paper facility, the sawmill into the port. So we're going to designate certain roads so that you're not cutting through an alley. I'm being facetious, but, so there's that. Then you look at another ordinance that addresses your point. All arterials, I'll just use a very broad term, are permissible within the state designed weight laws and criteria. They're allowed to leave that arterial to get to their delivery point, but it's like the shortest distance, the closest intersection. They don't want them wandering around. So that's a very broad, it's not a route per se, but it's an ordinance saying you can use the city street for limited purposes. And I think by a matter of business, you're going to hustle in and hustle out. You're just not going to be sightseeing. So there's that restriction that we could have a conversation about.
Yeah. So that helps, and, you know, I guess I think, you know, how enforceable will it be if, you know, if this is created? I mean, you know, we kind of had that discussion with Sergeant Arnold and you know, with this side of the room about compression brakes, right? Is it really enforceable? You know, I kind of brought up with Sergeant Arnold, and he kind of nicely said, no, all laws are important, but, you know, there probably are laws or ordinances that are more important to me than others, right? I am more desirous that police protect life and limb than I am about compression brakes, right?
Sure.
So I'm sensitive to that too, I guess, so.
Well, in part of this conversation, are there any examples or experiences that we might ask Mr. Ginkle about as to how his company addressed those or some of his experiences? I was trying to give a fair enough conversation as to if we make any suggestion or resolution out of this group.
I feel like I'm talking too much here, Mr. Chairman, like usual, but I do see the note here at the bottom of the page, and I would be interested in those topics as far as how designated truck routes in other communities has worked or not worked. I'd be interested in hearing that perspective if it's the will of the commission.
Mr. Ginkle, were there any, in your experience in dealing with your deliveries or in and out, were there any well, we don't have to talk about particular municipalities, but were there any circumstances that were more challenging than others for your business?
You know, not right off the bat, you know, we used to go to the Philadelphia market with potatoes. They're set up for short trucks. They always have been since probably the 1900s. You go in there with 53-footers, it's just a whole different game. So I do like the idea that you guys are planning ahead with the industrial zones and that. Hopefully the companies that are coming in and have that kind of traffic are buying into those places, at least from a trucking point of view. We always say take the big road because, you know, we have less accidents. In the end, it's faster. We know it's safer. And then after that, it's the secondary roads. And it seems like whenever we get in a neighborhood by the wrong turn or something, we buy somebody's tree or driveway or something crazy like that. So, you know, big trucks don't want to be in neighborhoods. And if a trucking company is using a neighborhood as a shortcut, then I just put a stop to that. The idea of these engine brakes between midnight and 6 a.m. just for awesome because there's no excuse for a trucking company to do that. You know, that's just a guy not flipping a switch. Otherwise, I've seen municipalities try and do time, you know, don't unload between 8 and 5, and that doesn't work because, you know, the businesses need the freight and they can't, you know, they don't want to put on a secondary crew to unload trucks. You know, then you mess with drivers' times that they can, you know, drive only certain hours and those kind of where you draw the line, but give the companies credit for trying to take the safest route and most efficient route. And if you decide to designate roads, make it real easy for companies to find those roads. You know, the state has their map with designated for 129 or 105 or 80,000 or 53 foot or shorter trailers. We look at that and it's color coded. We know, hey, we can't go there. Don't even try. So I guess that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions to ask Mr. Ginkle? Okay.
We like being involved. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Ginkle.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. McKinney.
as far as, what we want to see on this, it strikes me that maybe 2 things. The one is, it'd be nice if we had some sort of a draft ordinance to look at and to talk about specifically, and discuss the pros and cons of it. So if there's a way that we could get something drafted up that we could actually discuss specifically, I think that would be helpful. And in that respect, it strikes me that you've kind of 2 aspects here. The one is the sort of legal and enforceable side of it, and then the other is sort of the policy side of it. And I think to a large extent, designated truck routes is a policy matter primarily. And as Mr. Ginkle mentioned, it's in the interest of trucking companies to follow the routes that are the fastest and the safest and so on. And that aspect, that reality, works in favor of all the parties involved. And it strikes me that perhaps, and I could be wrong on this, but for the most part, the only kind of legal restriction that makes sense is a restriction that relates to purely residential streets, where you have a street that, like you gave the example there of the Lowe's on Eagle Road in Ustick, and it has an access road that it borders residential on one side and commercial on the other. Well, that's an obvious situation where it's not a purely residential road, but so it's the kind of thing that would be presumably open to truck traffic. On the other hand, your typical neighborhood streets that are purely residential, restrictions there make perfect sense with, a few exceptions for like a moving van and things like that. And so, I don't know, it seems to me that's kind of the direction we might want to look. And I think it would be helpful to have something we could look at as far as an actual proposed ordinance.
Okay. My research was not that extensive. I did reach out to the American Trucking Association and asked if there was a model ordinance, and nothing came back. But the more I looked at it, it seems, or at least my impression is, this is city-specific, it's fact-specific. What are the challenges for your particular town? Interestingly, as a side note, in the previous meeting, and it may be a one-off during a construction situation, there was a truck that decided to back across an arterial so they could back into this facility. I believe so Mr. Ginkle, you'll like this, rather than pulling into the turn lane and back on your left, pulled into the cross street and back across the 5 lanes of traffic. Yeah. I believe Sergeant Arnold or one of his people are going to go and have a conversation. And say, was that something unique about that, or is that a practice that you want to follow? Because if it is, we're going to discourage you. And there's other laws that are going to come into it. This is me speaking, not him. There's other ordinances we're going to talk to you about, the least of which is unsafe backing. So in designing that, Mr. McKinney, I'd have to do, there'd have to be more research done. And I I had thought from the campus study, there would be a model ordinance, but that didn't develop, because I don't know if there is something, facetiously, I said, you have an ordinance that says no trucks downtown. And that's a one-liner, and I've seen that in a couple of ordinances. But I think you have to go a little bit further than that. But if that's, so if the conversation is we bring back more research to another day, I or a steering committee, however we want to form that, we can do some more searching.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Lewis?
You know, to build on my earlier comments and head of Commissioner McKinney's comments, we're looking at two different things here, an ordinance or a policy. You know, the ordinance with restrictions to solve the problem, or a policy to encourage trucks to go on these routes that we have tried to make truck friendly, I guess, if I can use that term I used earlier. As far as the ordinance goes, I don't think I've heard of a problem in Reading we're trying to solve. So, you know, I don't think that we need to go down the ordinance route, but certainly adopting a policy to encourage certain routes, you know, to favor truck traffic would be a good thing.
Okay. So there's the, at least for conversation then, a position to take today, or is there additional study, or how do you want to dress that up, Mr. Lewis?
Well, I think there's some more study needed.
Okay. All right. Anyone else want to weigh in on this conversation? I've taken up a lot of time, Mr. Hood.
So maybe just a couple of thoughts. One, more study. I don't know who's doing that study, and I'm afraid it's me. Do some of that. I mean, we have a pretty good idea of where, and I'm going to even pare that back. So yeah, I tend to agree. I still struggle with what problem are we trying to solve? It's not like I'm answering a whole bunch of questions from folks like, why is this truck driving down my road all the time? You know, we just don't get that. So I don't know that we need an ordinance to that effect that prohibits trucks on any certain, at least not right now. But we could do some things, a map that says, hey, we encourage you to use these corridors because we've worked with our transportation partners to make the radii good for turning your trucks, for making the lane widths acceptable, for whatever those things are. We're working with folks to make it so it's easier to drive truck on it. Some of that's going to be an inventory, and again, just anecdotally, I kind of know where generally, kind of where we're at, a couple blocks either side on Franklin Road. Makes a lot of sense to, I don't know what may need to happen on Franklin to make it any more truck friendly, but that one makes sense to me as a truck route for the most part. We probably need a north-south. We've talked 10 mile. It's a lot of residential on 10 mile, but you're getting more and more non-residential along that corridor as well. Anyways, how do we want to gather that information? I can spend some time kind of on a map saying, hey, here's where they conglomerate to some degree, but I'm not going to be looking at the Fred Meyers and the Albertsons necessarily. Those are going to have deliveries, but it's going to be what it's going to be. You're still going to need to back a truck up there to load and unload. It's going to be more, and we don't have a port, so it's not like there's just stuff coming in. I know, you know, Sensi maybe does some of that, and like you said, Builders First Source maybe does a little bit of that, where they're a hub, and then there's distribution happening from there, but there's really not a lot of, and just that's not who we are. I mean, that's Caldwell and Boise and to some degree Nampa, but anyways, I don't really know what the next steps are, even though I heard some next steps in how gathering that information, doing some more work, what that looks like. So a little more direction on that, or if we get some volunteers in a small group or whatever.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hopkins?
I guess I'm kind of stumped a little bit on how much more studying needs to happen. I mean, I'm kind of with Commissioner Lewis. It seems to me truck routes are to give trucks guidance to make it easier for them to move through the quickest way possible, because as he said, they don't want to be in the neighborhood. Usually those guys' eyes are about as big as saucers when they're down stuck somewhere where they don't want to be and
Right.
trying to find their way out. So, and I don't think it would take this commission very long to go, hey, 10 miles, really good. Franklin's probably pretty smart. Eagle Road, you know, it's quite a bit of business. You're going to have trucks going down that. Chinden, I mean, it wouldn't take us very long and we could name at least truck routes where we prefer those trucks to move on and stay off the residential roads pretty quickly, it would seem like, without doing too much
Okay.
homework.
A couple of thoughts I had on that. Mr. Martin, is there any research from the Highway District that we could tap into?
Commissioners, ACHD did try to do truck routes in Boise City, Garden City, late 1990s, early 2000s, and politically, I don't think either Garden City or Boise City at the time wanted to pursue it any further, just for the same conversations you guys are having now. I'll just give you one example for how things don't work. When you're planning truck routes, I mean, trucks want to go from point A to point B. So when we built Curtis Road Extension, obviously that was a very political project. A lot of neighborhood along Curtis Road, they didn't want trucks going up and down Curtis Road, even though to the north you have the river, to the south you have the interstate. So what happened, we ended up signing Orchard Street, which is a half mile to the east, as the truck route. And that's all it said. It said, you know, trucks use Orchard or something along that line. So what happened, the trucks never used Orchard. They used Curtis because that's the route from A to B. And there was no ordinance to prohibit them to be on Curtis. So the trucks learned that they could use this. They're just going to ignore the sign. So, I mean, I guess my piece of advice is focus more on where you don't want trucks more than where maybe you do, because anywhere arterials, that's where the trucks are going to be. So I don't think you really need to have routes to say be on Linder, be on 10 Mile, be on Franklin, be on Eagle Road, Chinden. I mean, that automatically makes sense to me anyway.
Okay. Ms. Wood, I was thinking one other source, if we had a conversation with Lisa, try to drill down with her research, if she identified, I'll just call them bottlenecks, if you will, and I think that that's kind of what Mr. Martin is or a different name for what he's talking about. And I'm happy to have that conversation with her. So let's call for an action item from the commission. Mr. Lewis, do we move forward? Do we shelve it? Do we bring back a little more information? Putting you on the spot, but you kind of volunteered.
I think I gave my opinion, Mr. Chairman.
I misled that opinion.
I'm quite sure how to word that motion.
So, Mr. Chair, while he thinks a little
Mr.
bit
Hood?
more, again, I'm not opposed to doing some, but that direction will help. But it's not like we need more things to do. I mean, I've heard 3 or 4 different things, and again, I come back to what problem is, and I tend to agree with everybody when they come up with some different twist on this. I could be bought on encouraging truck routes or discouraging places we don't want them to go, either one. But I'm still back to what's going to be the outcome. Like with either one of those, if we don't draft an ordinance, they both seem like a waste of time to some degree. I guess just real quick, and again, I know Mr. Lewis is kind of on the clock here, but I did just pull up, and hopefully it's on the screen. Just when Lisa, and I can invite her back, Lisa Econom with Compass, she oversaw the freight study. But the map, I don't think it's a coincidence that basically the map is Boise Meridian area that gets cut off basically where Meridian begins, and the next place it picks up is in Nampa. Mm-hmm. There's just not that that much in Meridian that's an issue. The one area that we kind of have in Meridian is between Fairview and basically the Pine Corridor, Franklin, and you've got Food Services of America back in there, and you have some folks that have some trailers. But aside from that, which is basically Eagle Road, but aside from that, there's really nowhere else that have major warehouses that are coming and going. So again, I don't want to read too much into that, but even they kind of, Meridian's a void in where they've identified kind of natural, where freight wants to go or is going today.
Okay.
Mr.
After due consideration, Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we table this discussion.
Okay, so I have a motion to table it.
I second it.
We have a motion seconded by Mr. Hopkins to table this conversation. Call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. That's off the docket then. 6C.
D.
Appreciate your time, Mr. Ginkley.
I'm excused?
If you need be, sir.
No, I'm kind of having fun listening.
Okay. 6D, 2018 end of year report, Mr. Hood.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to, we briefly spoke about this last month. I want to just quickly touch base with everybody. Historically, short history, but I think this is our third end of year report that's been given to the mayor and council, if memory serves and that timeline works out. Third or fourth anyways. Fourth? Okay. So historically what we've done is I've kind of worked with the chair and copied the vice chair on what the activities of this commission throughout the year. I just want to kind of check in and make sure everybody's okay with that. And it's a pretty high-level summary. Usually it's 3 or 4 sentences. At this meeting, we talked about this, this, and this. This meeting, we had this person as a guest speaker, and we talked about this and that. So I was hoping maybe I would have made some progress on that. I haven't. I will share that with, unless other direction is given or you want to do this by committee and draft up our interview report. But just share it with, kind of work in close concert with the chair, and again, copy the vice chair on that, and then put it on your January meeting for adoption. But that doesn't really, and not that we can't change it then, but that's really kind of your one bite at the apple is in January. So is everybody okay with that approach? Yeah. Okay. And then have the chair or vice chair both be at a meeting in February, probably at the council meeting, to present that in person.
Very good. All right, we'll look forward to, so I'm assuming, is that a sit down with you for a few?
We'll talk, Mr. Chair. It's probably my turn to buy a cup of coffee, so maybe we do it in person.
That's fine.
Or we can do it electronically. I'm
Okay.
We'll get together on that.
All right. 6D, staff communications 6E, Mr. Hood.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we talked about the first item there, and it got tabled, or was, I guess we talked about it a little bit, just didn't have anybody to present on it. The second one is I do want to call to your attention. I followed up on compression brakes. This one was also an action item that you recommended to the mayor and city council to consider, and I took this one forward as well at the November 13th meeting. This one, the direction from this one being, what do we do at Paramount, south side of Rocky Mountain High School with their parking. And this one, what the mayor and council asked was that the chief of police meet with the neighbors in that area to kind of come up with, to understand and come up with a game plan out there. I know there's a large faction of that community, at least I've heard there's a large faction of that community that wants just the installation of additional limited duration parking. Phase 2, as John Wasson did a couple years ago. Some don't like that approach, though. They don't want to have any restriction on parking. They want to see the R sticker, the resident parking district, which was what your recommendation to the mayor and council were. I don't want to read too much into that, but the action of the council was, no, we're not ready to do that right now. We want the chief to sit down with the neighbors. And so that's kind of what you see here. We're trying to get together with that neighborhood to understand what their issues are, and if there's any other way besides our district, explore that further. So I think the council appreciated your recommendation and that you heard from the neighborhood and all that, but they weren't quite ready to to go there with an ordinance and the establishment of residential parking districts. So that's kind of what that is, just a quick update. The other one, the next one on page 17 is an update. I mentioned at the last meeting that very day there was going to be an open house at Compass to talk about 2026. The biggest thing there I want to just point out is that schedule update section there. So they're advancing quite a few sections of the Chinden corridor, beginning with Locust Grove to Eagle, which was a 2021 project, and they're advancing that to 2020. Also through the STARS project, it's the second bullet there, but ID 16 to Linder is also 2020, so that's a STAR project that will be done by Costco Forces. And then Linder to Locust Grove is also anticipated potentially as a STAR project with the Linder Village Winco project there, and then back out the other direction from STAR to 16 in 2020. So that's moving forward quite rapidly as a 4-lane facility. So just want to provide you that update. And then the last one, this kind of ties in with our last item topic, but this Wednesday at high schools, which one is it? Mountain View. There is a public hearing on the 129,000 pound loads. So if you're interested, want to learn more even about that, you could maybe go, and I imagine they have some information. This is a public hearing, so they're really looking to take public input. There was a question, excuse me, previously. The city did send a letter to ITD when Arlo G Lot Trucking, whatever that company
Arlo G
name.
Lot.
Yeah. When they requested to run these down Chinden a couple years ago, right around 2 years ago, I think, maybe it was even 2015. The city did send a letter to ITD. It asked questions more than had questions like, what do the turning radiuses? Is Chinden the right corridor? Can it support the weight of these? Those types of questions. What's the impact on our community if you were to approve this? It didn't take a stance one way or the other. It just said, hey, ITD, we recommend you think this through. We don't want to see, it be problematic in our community. So as long as you are answering these questions and have thought it through, if Chinden, and this was specific to Chinden, not, so 55 and 69 are the ones that are being proposed Wednesday night. We have not taken a stance on this particular request. Eagle Road, kind of to your point, at least in talking with the mayor, sort of seems like that's a natural route for bigger trucks. If you're going to run them anywhere, Eagle Road kind of makes some sense. So the city hasn't taken an official action, but we're staying silent on it, at least at this point. So, but if you're interested, there is that public hearing this Wednesday night from 4 to 7 at Mountain View. So usually I don't touch on all the staff communications, but this month...
You tagged all the bases.
Yeah.
Good job.
Home run then.
Yeah. All right. Any follow-up for Mr. Hood on item 6E? All right. 6 is closed. 7, future meeting topics. We'll have our election of officers January. The Linder Village project update, master mobility comprehensive plan, local jurisdiction on state highways. Any items to get on that list?
Mr. Chairman,
Lewis?
I just have a question on 7E. I don't recall the background why 7E is on the list.
That was my comment many months ago on what authority, if any, do local jurisdictions have on weighing in on, or can they regulate anything on a state highway or other facility?
Okay.
That was just an item I had brought up.
Okay.
Shall we delete it?
Well,
I'm open.
I think the answer is none, but I could be wrong on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's none unless delegated.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you want to remove 7E?
Sure. I'm open to that.
Okay. Anyone close to that? Mr. Lewis, by fiat, we strike 7E.
Yay me.
Okay. Anything else We've always left it, or at least in my tenure, I've left it open. If someone has a burning issue that's not on our agenda, if it needs to be discussed, bring it forward. Okay. Our next meeting is January 7th. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year's. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Seconded.
Second.
Any opposed? We go home. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I know we just adjourned, but I want to just touch base with everybody and let you know, historically, well, the last couple of years anyways, we do a holiday party, and you're kind of adopted as the closest department to community development. It's been so hectic, we haven't gotten our ducks in a row. So I just wanted to kind of plant a seed with you to let you know in January or February we'll probably have some type of a gathering, and you will be invited to that. So don't feel like we are forgetting you or whatever. It won't be anything super spectacular, but it'll be a free meal anyways. So more details to come. We just haven't been able to get it on the calendar. So just wanted to let you know. You are appreciated though. And yeah, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we'll see you on the flip side. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb.